All right, everyone, let's do it. We're going to go through why you need to develop your ego. Yes, that is correct. Now, what I mean by ego is I don't mean just the selfish, greedy part of you. I'm going to give you why our authentic self is actually our egoic self. Let's cover what we got here. The false self is the can be called the shadow self, the maladaptive self, the dysfunctional self, or the disowned self. They're our sticky points, the parts of ourselves that we struggle with. Moving to the other side here, what I'm calling the real self is that state of experience we can have that is normally found through spiritual practice and sometimes substances, where we get this big opening, where it's a massive sense of freedom, and it's a very, very real, some people say the realest experience they've had. Now, a lot of spiritual people will on the mission to get as much as this as they can a lot of the time. And typically people that are achievers or performers will be working most mainly in this self, which is their competencies, their relationships, their values, stabilizing identities, really having a path and an aim, and becoming a someone. This is our authentic self, which is our ego. That's the whole point of it. Is we don't have a choice, but we have to live an egoic self, which is assert ourselves forward in the world. Okay, so what I typically see is we have our false, painful parts of us that can be alleviated by practices that get us here, whether that's breath work, whether that's meditation, whether that's any mindfulness, forms of all of that, and some substances. So we don't want to fall in the trap of using our meditation as medication to get us from here over to here. If we don't like our messiness, we can go sit on the cushion, we can go, take some substances that we like, we can go do our breath work, and we can relieve that partially. We relieve it through a state change. But what happens is a state change, we go back, and then inevitably we come back into this. Whether you stop meditating, stop doing, some yin yoga, or you leave the classroom, or you leave the teacher, or you leave whatever your method is of this real sense, which is very free, as soon as you leave the method, it feels like you jump back into these patterns. That is because there's a denial of this guy here, the egoic self, the substance of you. As I said, the competencies, the aims, the goals, the relationships, the values, the establishing yourself. This is either typically called the spiritual bypass, or sometimes the developmental bypass. So doing the work in here does something quite unique. It's very painful to look at this. It's typically the emotional work, the cleanup stuff, and really establishing yourself, getting uncomfortable, having a lot of courage, pushing your boundaries, growing. This is where a lot of the personal development work happens. And it's ego development. And now, why is that important? Well, it's actually critically important because once you stabilize this and you've got some runs on the board, right, you're becoming someone you respect, you're becoming someone you can trust, then something quite unique happens. When we go from our authentic self and we start getting back into our spiritual practices, why would we do that? Well, our authentic egoic self gives us the fullness of life, but our expansive spiritual practices give us the freedom in life. Fullness, freedom, ego, real self. Or ego, you could call it wise self, big self, whatever you want to call it. Now, when we go from authentic self to real self, this can happen. There's a merge. And when these two merge, they lock into place. And no longer is it a state change, is you actually get a trait change. A trait change is a sense of inner change that will never go back. And so it's said the biggest egos hold up the biggest spiritual states and stabilize the biggest spiritual states. Therefore, biggest egos have the potential to be the most free. And that's the paradox. That's the non-dualism. We bring them together. When I'm working with a spiritual person, I've got to pull them down sometimes. I've got to pull them down back into their ego. And when I've got a really developed achiever, I'm getting them to practice and practice and practice and merge that sense of freedom with their competencies. And that is where we get some really, really incredible flourishing of life. So that is why we need to ego develop.